So today, what I wanted to talk about, this is a series. I was going to call it Disclosures Palooza, but then, that sounded kind of stupid. So disclosures, disclosures, disclosures. I don't know, that doesn't sound much better. We're going to be going through the basic disclosures that you need to know as a real estate agent in the state of California. And I'm going to talk about, this is going to be somewhat practical about what you actually need to do as a real estate agent rather than in the theory of all of this. For those of you that don't know me, I don't know how you ended up here, but I'm a certified trainer for the California Association of Realtors when it comes to forms. I'm also certified by the California Association of Realtors to teach zip forms. I'm an icon instructor for EXP. I used to be a certified trainer for Keller Williams, and prior to that, I was the director of training for Century 21 for Northern California, and that was a while ago. But anyhow, and I have a large team at EXP. It's called a Mega Icon team, and so I wanted to make this video because it's self-serving, right? I have a lot of people on my team and I get lots of questions about how do we fill out the TDS, SPQ, the AVID, all that kind of stuff. So that's what we're going to talk about. Now there's a handout, two of them, which talks, one of them are some of the forms and things I'm going to go over. There's one about exemptions and things like that. And I'm going to actually show you what software you might want to use in order to, in order to do this, right? So if you were looking at the handouts, I'm just using information from the California Association of Realtors legal department. And generally speaking, when we're talking about who has to provide a transfer disclosure statement, what we're looking at is pretty much most of the sales. How about that? Most of the sales that involve 1 to 4 units residential. So the transfer disclosure statement is not required on land, not required on commercial transactions, 5 or more units, it's not required. There's also some exemptions. And exemptions, right? And so this is another handout. And maybe I should have just used this one, I don't know. But here are the various exemptions. Now, to just sort of say it, what's usually exempt is anything that could involve a court, bankruptcy, a conservatorship, a receivership, and certain kinds of trusts. So there's 2 kinds of trusts that we usually run into as a real estate agent. One is called a vested trust. And in a vested trust, well, somebody's died. And so the estate is now in the hands of the trust. There's a trustee who, in the language of wills, would be an executor. There are beneficiaries, which using will language would be an heir. Now, if it's a vested trust, that means somebody has died, then it's exempt from the transfer disclosure requirement, right? It's exempt. So not exempt from the agent visual inspection disclosure requirement, but exempt from the transfer disclosure statement if the trust is a living trust, a family trust. In other words, it's a husband and wife or 2 husbands and 2 wives. It's a couple and they own property in a trust and they're both still alive. That is not an exempt transaction, right? That's a living trust. If it's exempt, we would be using, there's something called an exempt seller disclosure, which I'm not going to get into. Transfers involving a public report, new home subdivisions. New home subdivisions are exempt. Right? And that's because they get a public report and the public report does a lot of that stuff. All right, so that's the more than I wanted to do on that. But anyhow, I've included, I think, that handout, which has more. So a seller is required when selling a property without an agent. In other words, for sale by owners. Every sale of a 1 to 4 unit residential property that doesn't involve one of the exemptions, this is required. It's a statutorily defined form, all right? And when should it be provided? I'm going to talk about that. If the transfer disclosure statement is provided to the buyer after the buyer has executed an offer to purchase, the buyer's going to get 3 days if it was hand delivered to the buyer, which it never is anymore. 5 days if it was sent by email to the buyer, and that 5 days is a statutory right to cancel the contract. Now, I didn't put together some quizzes for you guys, maybe next time, right? That'll make it more fun, wouldn't it? Especially when I publish, your scores. But let me ask you this. If the buyer makes an offer, and you guys can chat your answers, right? This is a yes or no question. If the buyer has made an offer and the buyer makes the offer with no contingencies, they use the contingency removal form, they check the third, number 3, the buyer hereby removes any and all contingencies, right? No contingencies, but the buyer has not yet been given a copy of the TDS, and then the buyer is given a copy of the TDS. Can the buyer back out based upon the TDS? Let's see if you guys are willing to play. Anybody want to? We've got a yes, and another yes, and another yes, and a whole bunch of other yeses, even if they remove their contingencies. And the answer is yes, and that is very good. I'm not going to have to send those to the DRE, those responses. And the reason is that the transfer disclosure statement and that 5-day ability is to cancel is in the California Civil Code. All right, let me ask you a follow-up question. Get ready with your yeses or nos. There is nothing wrong in the TDS. There is, when the TDS is given to the buyer, there is actually nothing in it that the buyer could find objectionable, and the buyer still wants to cancel the transaction. And before you answer, I want you to understand that there's a clause in the residential purchase contract that says that everybody, buyers or whatever, have to act in good faith. That's what it says. So the TDS given after the buyer has entered into a contract doesn't disclose anything wrong with the property. Can the buyer still back out? Let's see if you guys got answers to that one. Anybody? All right, I'm starting to see no, the buyer cannot back out because there's nothing wrong. We only had one person, a yes. We're getting started, a no. Gee, no. Right now we're getting a bit of a debate over that, and the answer is yes, they can still back out. And although this seems picky, the ability to back out using the transfer disclosure statement is written into the California Civil Code. And the clause in the residential purchase agreement that says everybody has to act in good faith can't change the wording of the California Civil Code. Now, what's interesting, I've actually had this come up in a heated transaction, is that the SPQ is different. So if the SPQ is given amended, let's say, and we're going to talk about the SPQ, and there's another 5-day right of rescission based upon what the purchase agreement says. The SPQ is different because that's not a statutory obligation, it's a contractual obligation. So to back out based upon the SPQ would require good faith. The back out on the TDS does not require good faith. It's in the civil code, you can just back out. So that's why it is way better if you're the listing agent to get the TDS, the SPQ, and all of that stuff all together, signed by everybody, and give it to the buyer prior to the buyer making an offer. Does the buyer lose their EMD? The answer is no. If the buyer backs out based upon the California Civil Code section, they get their money back. If they back out based upon something in the purchase agreement, they get their money back, assuming they haven't removed all their contingencies, right? So removing your contingencies, you could lose the EMD based upon the SPQ and the HOA and other things that you may not like, but the TDS overrides all that, right? If the buyer backs out based upon being given the TDS within 5 days, they get their money back. And the contract, that's just what the code says. All right. So what does it look like? Now, I'm going to show you the two most common ways of having sellers fill this out. So what I normally would do if I were on a listing appointment and they're like, okay, we're ready to go, let's do it. And so I'm like, okay, great, let's do it. What I'm going to do is after they've signed the listing agreement, I'm going to tell them that I'm going to send them some disclosures that need to be filled out. And I always would break the disclosures into two groups. The first group involves the TDS and the SPQ. And the reason I keep those separate is because those are the two that the seller actually has to think about in order to fill it out. They have to think about it. Right? The others, the statewide buyer and seller advisory, the wire fraud advisory, all of those other advisories, the seller doesn't really even have to think about them very much. There's only a few occasions and all of that where they can even answer questions, right? But that would be, and now I might also include, well, first of all, I do the TDS and the SPQ first. There's an earthquake that has some questions, but I do these first because these are the more difficult more challenging for them to do. So reading along, it talks about in section 1, coordination with other disclosures. Let me just see. Why would the listing agent only disclose the TDS and SPQ after escrow is open and the receipt of the EMD from escrow? If you're asking me, Nina, a question about a particular transaction, I think that agents, this is my opinion, listing agents who don't get a prelim, don't get all the disclosures together, don't get inspections and reports, don't do all that, is doing a disservice to their client. That's my opinion. So sometimes the seller's uncooperative, but what we would want is all of the disclosure forms filled out in advance. And we're going to go through them all. Not today, but next week and the week after and all that. We're going to go through them. So one of the parts of this that I find is very confusing, and there's some reasons why it's here, let me just see, is the section here where there are some boxes to check and you can write in. For example, it's asking about other inspection reports. Now, you might, or additional inspection reports, right? Now, you might be thinking, well, isn't that where I'm going to be putting in a bunch of other things? Like I'm going to be putting in the property inspection, and I'm going to put in the termite inspection, and I'm going to put in the pool inspection, and I'm going to check those boxes, and I'm going to type all those inspections in that line there. Don't do that. What you should be checking here is that there are no substituted disclosures. Now, you might be thinking, wait a second, but I've got additional inspections and reports. Isn't that what that's talking about? And the answer is no, that's not what it's talking about. It's talking about substituted disclosures. And notice these disclosures are intended to satisfy the, let me see if I can get this to cooperate. It's intended to satisfy the disclosure obligations on this form where the subject matter is the same. Now, what's going on here is the form was written a long time ago, 1987, I think it was, in section 1102 of the California Civil Code. And at the time they wrote the form, they being the people that were form writing for the state legislature, were thinking maybe at some time in the future, we're going to come up with some super kind of property inspection and people will have the option of getting that instead of doing the TDS. That's what they were thinking. Now, what's happened since 1987 is they've never done that. They have never come up with a substituted disclosure. Notice what this says. This disclosure would be intended to satisfy the disclosure obligations on this form, where the subject matter is the same. So I would be asking you, if I have a property inspection, does that satisfy the seller's obligation to do a TDS? And the answer is no, it does not. What if I have a termite report and a roof report and that does not satisfy the disclosure obligations of this form? So why then, if this doesn't exist, do they have these boxes and lines for me to write on? And the answer is because the form is required to reflect what is in the civil code, which was written back in 1987, and the CAR can't just change it. So what you should be doing is checking no substituted disclosures. That's what you should be doing. Is it the end of the world if you write in the other stuff? I don't know. I'm just saying it's not correct, right? Because a property inspection is not a substituted disclosure. All right. So then the rest of this is answering questions, right? And I'm going to jump into how would you really do that, right? And so they check boxes, and if there's anything wrong or broken, they're supposed to write in what it is. And they've gone to the trouble now of adding a bunch of things that explain. Installation of a listed appliance, device, or amenity is not a precondition of sale or transfer of the dwelling to carbon monoxide. It's just asking them questions. And then they ask a group of other questions, of which one is almost always checked. And that's the one about features of the property shared in common. For example, walls, fences, and driveways. I didn't mean to do that. But most houses, single-family homes, many of them have a shared fence, right? Sometimes there's shared walls. So if that's true, you would check yes. But I oftentimes see a bunch of no's here. But they should think about it. Neighborhood noise problems or other nuisances. If there really are, they should say yes. Right. There have been cases where the seller said, no, I don't know of any noise problems in the area. And then the buyer buys and the buyer moves in, and there's a lot of loud music from the house next door, and they call to complain. And then the police say, what's your address? And they say, oh, you guys are calling again. What do you mean calling again? Well, the people that were living at that address, they've complained like 5 or 6 times. Oh, really? Really? Right? So you understand that's fraud. And I'm just saying, right? So if there are noise issues, they should answer it truthfully. So we're going through the form. Notice the section about smoke detectors is here. And the smoke detector compliance is built into the form. Seller certifies that the property will be in compliance by having operable smoke detectors. Now, what I sometimes see is sometimes listing agents, in addition to having a TDS as part of their disclosure package, they've gone through zip forms and they found the smoke detector statement of compliance form and they throw it in. And if you read it, it's pretty much the same words that are here. What about the water heater? Shouldn't that be a separate form? Well, it also, the certification is here. So my opinion is if you've got a TDS filled out by the seller, you don't need those smoke detector and water heater statement of compliance forms in addition to the TDS. Well, then why do they have smoke detector and water heater compliance forms when it's built into the TDS? And the answer is they're transactions that are exempt from a TDS. And by the way, just because the transaction is exempt, the appraiser is going to want to see smoke detectors and is going to want to see carbon monoxide detectors. Here's the agent's visual inspection disclosure. Now I'm just going to mention this, and then I'm going to go into the actual software that we would use to fill the first parts out. Should I do that first? Maybe. Depending upon, let me say this about the AVID. I'll spend more time on it. depending upon the office you work with. Like I work at EXP, and we're a big company, and the bigger the company is, the more rules they typically had. And what they want to see is an AVID form, the Agent Visual Inspection Disclosure. They don't generally want to see agent notes nothing, right? And or agent notes the following items. I sometimes see that as I sometimes see that when that's all the listing agent has done. I don't know, right? In our company, they would rather you do an AVID form. So let's talk about how would you fill this out. There are generally, well, four ways of doing it. Let's say I'm in a transaction and I'm going to open up a transaction. So what are the four ways of doing the TDS? Number one, super old school. You print them out. You drive over to the seller's house and you let them use a stubby pencil or something to go through and write on it. I still see some of those, right? Sometimes it's very hard to read the writing, right? Very hard. So let me see, have I created any parties here? Yeah, why not? I usually do. So let's say I wanted to use, so one thing is you could print them out, take them over there, they could write with a pencil or whatever, sign it, and then you could scan it and upload it. I haven't done that in a really long time. The other is you could use zip forms to send it out. Now, one of the things that you're going to notice is that as an agent, some of it is redacted. Is that the right word? Blacked out, well, sort of dark grayed out. And everything that you see that is dark grayed out, you as the agent cannot complete. You can only complete the parts that are sort of in that yellowish, orangish one. Now, the first problem is, remember I explained no substituted disclosures. That's going to be a question your client is supposed to answer, right? And you might want to, maybe tell them that there aren't any substituted disclosures, and you could send this to the client for signature, and then the client could go through and check boxes, type in stuff, and when they're done, sign it and be done with it. The interface is not that good. I'm just saying this is not an easy form to fill out using zip forms. It's just my opinion, right? Not an easy one. So what would be an easier way to do it? And again, we would log in like we're going to secure transactions, but we're going to scroll down and we're going to go to something called Seller's Shield. And in Seller's Shield, we used to use a program called Glide. And I actually do know there are a few associations that still use Glide. The reason that most don't, including the CAR, and most don't, is that Compass bought Glide. Now, I'm sure that the people at Compass don't actually look at the data. I'm sure they don't, right? Why would they be concerned or interested in your transactions and who you're sending documents? Why would they care about that, right? Well, because real estate agents are generally paranoid. And by the way, just because you're paranoid, that doesn't mean you don't have real enemies, right? We don't use Glide anymore. And so Seller's Shield replaces Glide. And if you're like, I never knew what Glide is, that's fine. I don't have to, but they look a lot alike. And we click Visit Now. Welcome, CAR members. If you've never done this before, click on watch the little video. You can sign up for free. The login would be the same as logging into CAR.org. And so exactly the same, hit continue, password. Is that it? No. How about that? All right. So once you've learned to log in, this is what it looks like. And you could again watch a tour, but you could invite a seller. And so they're going to ask for an address here, 124 Sample Avenue, San Jose, California. There's the name of the seller, email, it's actually mine, whatever. You can put in a text message. People can do this on their phone, add additional sellers, right? Right now, we're just going to go with one. Which of the following disclosure forms would you like your client to complete? Now, the TDS and the SPQ are, well, sorry for the pun, but it's TDS, right? It's tedious. There's a lot of questions. This could take a time. So I want to do them. I want to do those first, maybe in batches. If your client has the stamina and energy, you can do more. So what I typically am doing is the transfer disclosure statement and the seller property questionnaire. You could see, depending upon the board you're a member of and what documents you have, there's going to be other choices. There's the San Francisco seller disclosure, which we could be sending if it was in San Francisco. The earthquake risk disclosure statement is, and I know you guys already know this, but that's a form that the seller has to fill out if it's a single family home built before 1960, or a wood frame home, that's what I meant, built before 1960, or a masonry building built before 1975, right? But you guys already knew that. In many, maybe not, many times we just have them fill it out, because that 1960 to 1975, most people don't know. You might as well have them fill it out because it's going to maybe on somebody's checklist, whatever. But I try to just keep it, you know, to these two to begin with, and then maybe send them some more later. But you can see, I'm going to talk about fire hardening, some of these other things. Let's just say those are the only two we're going to do. So we click on this. They want to sell you stuff, right? And the stuff they would like to sell you is legal protection and things like that. And we're probably not going to do that because we really don't want to, right? And so we're going to select no protection package. But if your client, you know, wants legal protection, go ahead, right? But we got E&O, I never do that. We click on going, access is granted. You have granted Superman and access to the smart seller tools. Okay, wonderful. So if we were to, so what does that look like? So let me go over here. And it hasn't come through yet, but it shall soon, I hope. It's going to come through. All right. Come on. And we'll come back to that, right? Because what it's going to do is it's going to eventually send not started, right? So what this is saying that Sue has not started it yet, and we've not opted into the protection. Let's just see, Seller's Shield. There we are. This is what it looks like. By the way, it wouldn't hurt for you guys to create a sample and send one to yourself, just so you can go through the process. So when your client is asking questions, you know what to do. So we click on Start Now, and here it is. And we're just going to click on it. And maybe because I'm logged in, it's not letting me do this as it's doing something different. So I'm not going to do this right now, but you might want to, here. The problem I'm having is that I'm already logged in. And so it knows that. And so as soon as I get there, it wants me to log in. Here we go. So this is what it looks like from the client's point of view. And we click on continue. There's the address. There's the name of the client. They get to set a password. And we do this. Maybe it didn't like the password because I didn't do it long enough. Okay, so I made it, yes. I didn't like, I was trying to do it quickly. So now it's going to create an account for the client. And the way that this works, the reason why this is so much easier than the zip forms is because, well, you'll see. After we go through a few things, we click on yes, we click on continue. And so now they're trying to sell. I may start using the other one. They're still trying to sell stuff. And so what we don't want to do that. We just click on continue, continue. Do they keep wanting me to sell stuff? No protection. This is new, right? But anyhow, they're really trying hard to sell stuff. So we're going to use one that isn't quite so difficult. So we click on this. So this is what the seller is going to see. Last time I did it, it did not keep pimping all of their protection. So this disclosure information advisory is a form that's in zip forms, and they simply lifted the words out of it. It gives them the general instructions, right, about it. See this, you can see why I break this up, but they click on this and they click on next. Now, please indicate the county in which the property is located, Santa Clara, and today's date is, all right, and then we go through and no substituted disclosures, and is the seller occupying the property? You see, these are relatively simple to answer, right? That form with all the different grids is very difficult, but they can just go through and say, I got a range, I got a microwave, I've got a dishwasher, an oven, a garbage disposal, I have washer dryer hookups, and then, you know, there are little questions that they could answer. And then they go through, and when they're done, it's answered, and it now goes to the agent. It goes back into your zip forms. All right. So that seller's shield, they have added a lot of stuff. Now I can see why they're providing it for free to California Association of Realtors members. I can see why. There's another option. And the other option is, let's say you're with a large company like EXP. Some of the Keller Williams I worked at also use SkySlope. And SkySlope has something called Breeze. And what I like about Breeze is that it doesn't have all the advertising, unless it's also not owned by another real estate company. And oh, how about this one? Let me go back. Now I realize what my issue is. All right. I'm not going to use Seller's Shield because of all of that, all of the buy this, buy this, buy this. Yes, okay. Now, Breeze has a very similar interface in that it's relatively easy for people to fill out. And you can invite a team, right? If you click on this, you can collaborate, send disclosures, right? We're not going to really get into that, but we're going to click on Start New Disclosures. And if you've already created a file, you would do this. We're going to notice you can put in the MLS number, sample. And we fill it out. And then notice here, notice it's a lot, kind of the same, but note they have more of them that are available in SkySlope. There's the transfer disclosure statement, the seller property questionnaire. We put in the APN. I'm just making up one. Because I don't really know. The client, who are you sending it from? Now, notice the nice thing about Breeze, if the client is an entity or organization, you can click on that because, there's representative capacity. And we click on next. Brokerage name. Click on next. And personalized emails are here. So this is what the email looks like. And, let's say we like it. We click on next. Here's the team. You could add team members like a transaction coordinator, whatever, which I have one. We click on send and here we are, right? And notice the status is waiting response. So we go back to our inbox. Here it is. This is what Breeze looks like. Nice little email. Start your disclosures. And I'll bet they're not trying to sell you anything, right? So here's a privacy notice. Click on continue. Here's the address. Does this look correct? Sure, why not? Go to the form. And then we hit start. And there's this little statement here and coordination with other disclosures. Do you have substituted disclosures for this transfer? No. Right? Remember, we don't have substituted disclosures. Sellers, these are just information for them to read. Next, do you occupy the property? Yes or no. Notice how easy that is, right? Because we just start answering questions. Is the seller shield upsell worth gifting to our clients? Probably not, in that it depends, right? Basically, they're selling additional protection. If you had a client that was concerned about litigation, let me just say this: errors and omissions insurance protects us, but not the seller. They're not covered by our E&O, and it only protects us to the level of an error or an omission, not fraud, right? So whether or not, if they're worried about it, if they were failing to make adequate disclosures, I generally don't do that, right? But and part of the problem, if you're going to buy your client a gift, buying them something to protect them when they get sued just sort of has a bad ring to it, I think. It's just my feeling. So I've never done that. And I don't know. I've never had a client sue. So we would hit start and then notice they just check boxes. Yeah, I got that, I got that, I got that, I got that. I don't got that, but I got that. They just go through and they check things, right? This is a relatively easy form to fill out. No upsells, none of that sort of stuff. Is Breeze free? I believe it might be. Breeze might be free, but certainly if you're with like EXP, we use SkySlope for our transaction coordination, and therefore we have access to this, and it works really well, and doesn't have all the upsells, nice interface, and it connects to all the different documents that you need. All right. So how are we doing? All right, a couple more things. The seller property questionnaire. So the SPQ is not a statutorily required disclosure, but it's in the residential purchase agreement. And is it required? The answer is depending upon which purchase agreement is used. But the vacant land doesn't. Some of them do not. Can Google Translate be used here in Chinese? I don't know about that. Whether or not you can try it. I think that they may have, I don't know what other languages they have of these things. Any exemptions, whatever. I'm not going to really go through all of this. It's in the residential purchase agreement. And this is what the SPQ looks like. Now, most of this is just more questions for the client to fill out. And again, if we were to go into zip forms to do this, all of the ones that the sellers are supposed to answer are going to be blacked out, right? Because that we can't fill it out and then have them sign it. They have to fill it out, which is why I'm talking about Seller Shield and Breeze. Let's go with Breeze. And have you ever had a meth lab in your house? All those different questions. Now, I'm not going to go through it line by line. This is sort of something you might have to do with your client, but there's one thing I want to point out. Title, ownership, liens, and other legal claims. Is the seller involved in any litigation, past, present, or pending? Right? And you see that past, present, or pending lawsuits or threatened settlements, mediation, arbitrations, right? Do they know of any of those? Features shared in common, which may have an effect on the property because of maintenance. Any encroachments. So an encroachment would be, well, my neighbor has built the fence over the property line. Easement, boundaries disputes. And every time somebody says yes, they're supposed to add in any, they're supposed to explain. And if their explanations go too long, it generates an additional addendum that's called a text overflow addendum, where it just starts filling it out. Neighborhood noise, they're asking them more specific questions. Past or present disputes or issues with the neighbor. Any government actions going on that you know about. Others. Now, look at others. Any past or known material defects. How am I doing on this? There's also a segment here. Let me just. Oh, anyway, maybe I'm not. So other inspection reports and things that they had are something that they should also include. So this is the seller property questionnaire. So let's do the last one for today. My seller had a Word document with answers to the yes on SPQ. Is that okay? Sure, that's okay. It also, if they copied it and pasted it in, it would automatically go into this text overflow addendum. But I've seen agents just give a sheet and referring to it. The nice thing about the text overflow addendum is that the overflow is connected to specific paragraphs in the form. Otherwise, you'd have to type them in. All right, agent's visual inspection disclosure. Let's talk about that. Even if the property is exempt from the TDS, it's not exempt from the AVID. There's some, assuming it's a 1 to 4 unit residential property. Your agent visual inspection disclosure is not required on vacant land. It's not required on commercial properties, right? Not required. And commercial is 5 or more units in terms of a residential building, not required. It's not required on a new home subdivision. But if, let's say, it's a probate, it's a trust sale, it's something like that, so the seller doesn't have an obligation to do a TDS, you as the listing agent still have to do an AVID. What if the seller had the home inspection done after they filled out the SPQ? Do they need to go back and disclose it? The answer is no, but that's a very good question. This part is, I don't know, is the word controversial. All right. As long as the material facts are disclosed to the buyer, with the buyer having time to understand them, digest them, and given a right to back out because of the contents. Now, if you gave all of the disclosures prior to the buyer writing an offer, then all of that information is assumed to be included in their decision. So let's say the seller misses something on the TDS. Let's say you as the listing agent miss that same thing on your AVID, but the property inspector sees it and highlights it, and you've given a copy of the property inspection to the buyer can't say that you didn't disclose it, right? The buyer can't really say that because there it was in the property inspection. If the termite inspection mentions it, then you've disclosed it. So when does the content of your AVID, this is a little controversial, but when does the content of your AVID really make a difference? Well, let's say the seller was exempt. There's no inspections, no property inspection, no termite inspection, nothing. The buyer is an amateur buyer making an offer, and you're representing the buyer as well, right? And the buyer isn't going to pay for inspections either. At this point, you've become the only professional in this transaction who's going to be able to give an opinion about the quality of the property, right? You're the only one, right? There's no property inspection, there's no TDS, there's nothing. So in that circumstance, what you write would take on more weight. It would be, there'd be more responsibility. If, however, the seller did the best they could with the TDS and the SPQ, and you have a property inspection, and by the way, my suggestion is if the property inspector says you need to get somebody to inspect the electrical panel, you need to get somebody to inspect the plumbing, you need to get somebody to inspect the foundation, you do all that if you're representing the seller, and you get all those inspections in the file. At which point you've disclosed everything that you pretty much possibly could. That lowers the bar for what you're doing in your AVID, or even what they're doing in the TDS or SPQ, right? So that does. So if you get a property inspection, you don't have to go back and change your AVID, nor does the seller have to change the TDS or the SPQ, unless it was something that they said, oh no, I just didn't even realize that, right? Now, if you do all this, you know, oh yeah, I knew that. Oh yeah, I knew that the plumbing leaked, I just forgot to mention it. So that sort of thing, we would amend the TDS, right? We would amend it, right? Because if there was something obvious that the seller knew about, but they didn't put on the TDS, we would amend it. If it was something they weren't aware of, but the property inspector found it, we don't go back and change the TDS or the SPQ. I hope that makes sense. Right, and if you get all the inspections and things like that, it lowers the weight that's on the shoulders of the real estate agent, which is another good reason to do this. The civil code and the residential purchase agreement only require the listing agent to have the AVID. Now, that's not said perfectly. The civil code says both agents are supposed to do it. However, If the buyer's agent fails to do an AVID, it has no effect on the transaction. That's repeated in the RPA as well. Now, if you work for a real brokerage, they're going to want you to do the AVID and they're going to want it to be in the file. But I'm just saying, of the two AVIDs, the buyer's agent's AVID or the listing agent's AVID, it's the listing agent's AVID that is required by the civil code, or you can cancel. If the listing agent gives their AVID to a buyer after the execution of the offer, the buyer has 5 days to cancel. If the buyer's agent gives an AVID to the buyer after execution of the contract, the buyer has no days to cancel. Right? There's no cancellation right tied to the buyer's agent AVID. And that also says that in the RPA, which you already knew. So the listing agent's AVID, right? When you're at the property, you ought to do it. Like if they're doing, sometimes I've had the clients do the TDS and the SPQ while I'm there, just so if they had questions, they could ask me, right? If there was questions, they could ask me. And while they're doing it, I might be walking around doing my AVID. Now, when we do an AVID, right, and some of this is a little, I don't know, mixed up in my view. But so if we're doing the AVID, a lot of it is self-explanatory. If the property is a multifamily, we would check a box, and then we would be doing one for each unit. Inspection performed, real estate broker name. So in this place is I would be typing eXp Realty. And then this is just, you know, stuff, which basically says all the things we don't do. And then we get here, again, if it's a duplex, triplex, we put in the unit number, inspection performed, real estate broker firm name. Again, it's the same one, eXp Realty. We put in the date, the time, the weather conditions, is it raining, is it sunny, what other persons present. You know, I don't know, right? If the clients were there, you could list them. Oftentimes I don't, but whatever. Sometimes agents are doing this when there's a property inspection. So now that we're looking at it, entry. One general comment is don't use adjectives. Adjectives like normal, small, large, right? So if we see wear and tear, we don't say normal wear and tear, we say wear and tear. If there's cracks in the entry, let's start with the entry. So you're walking into the house. What kinds of things could you mention? Well, is it uneven, right? Is the concrete pushed up where it could be a trip hazard? Walkway uneven, right? You don't say small, minor trip hazards, right? You just say uneven walkway. If there's vegetation hanging over that you might trip, you might say vegetation is hanging over the walkway, right? And so this is the entry. And yes, that I understand that entry also means once you're inside, you're looking around, and if there's nothing, right, nothing, you would simply type in nothing noted, right? If you can't find anything. If you go to the living room, right, is assuming they have a separate one, well, they usually do. It's a family room that could be separate. You look around, are there scratches on the floor? Are there marks on the wall? Is there discoloring in the ceiling? You know, if there are, you would say cracks on the wall. You would say discoloring in the ceiling. And by the way, it wouldn't hurt to take pictures, because you're going to see it's possible for you to attach the photographs later. You can attach the photographs. Dining room, again, the same thing. Kitchen, other room would be like a family room. If there are no other rooms, you just put in NA for not applicable. Halls, stairs, if they don't have any, there's usually a hall. You'd write in bedroom number 1, bedroom 2, bedroom 3. If there's only 2 bedrooms, you would just say not available, NA for not applicable. Do the same thing with bathrooms, any other rooms, others. Don't write in, maybe your broker has a different opinion, don't write in a bunch of poetry about I am not a property inspector and I recommend you ought to get a property inspection. All that, none of that really belongs on an AVID, right? The AVID is your reasonably diligent visual inspection of the property. Notice the addendum for additional rooms or structures, garage, parking, exterior, other of known conditions. And then it's a reasonably competent, diligent visual inspection. Again, real estate broker. So by this point, I've put in eXp Realty 3 times. First page, top of the second page, this page, right? You put it in 3 times. And then here is where you're going to be signing it. Right? This is where you're going to be signing it. So it would say eXp Realty by Michael Devlin, date, buyer signs, seller signs, and away we go. Now, I'm not going to go into the how do you attach photos, but when we do the, where are we? Here. Maybe I've already got it open. How about this? So in this is what it would look like in zip forms. Notice we can fill this out. So sometimes I write the stuff down when I'm there. I'll take photos, right? The easiest thing for me to do rather than write down notes is just take photos of things that I want to include. Then I type it up so it looks nice and neat. And there are, type it up, right? So it looks nice and neat. What else do I want to do? And we could add an addendum for more stuff. Any questions about that? Was that a useful discussion? I try to keep it to an hour. All right. Well, maybe you're out of questions. That's great. So I see we've reached our appointed time. Next week, I'm going to do a couple of these. I'm going to go through some of the other disclosures. For example, next week, I'm going to talk about local area disclosures. What are they? How do you find them? Why do you need them? What would you do with them? As well as some of the other disclosures that are required in a typical real estate transaction. Again, hopefully with the idea of how to, here, let me just see how to fill it out. Where do you attach photos? I was hoping somebody wouldn't ask me that. Where do you attach photos? How do we attach photos? Yeah, that's a good question. So give me a second.